Imagine the crackle of dry wood under a hot wind, the acrid scent of smoke mingling with fear, and the helpless scream of a woman bound to a stake, her fate sealed not once but twice. In medieval Europe, burning at the stake was reserved for the gravest offenses: heresy, witchcraft, and treason. Yet certain victims endured not only the agony of one immolation but the indignity of a second burning of their remains. The most famous case is that of Joan of Arc, condemned as a heretic in 1431, burned in Rouen, and then in 1456, ceremonially burned again when the Church posthumously nullified her trial, her condemnation sentence discarded in flames. But Joan's story represents only the pinnacle of a darker tradition. Authorities feared that the body of an executed heretic might somehow continue to wield power, inspire cults, or serve as a source of demonic mischief. To understand why they burned her alive twice, we must begin with medieval attitudes toward the body and the soul. In the Christian worldview, the human body was more than mere flesh. It was the temple of the soul, destined for the resurrection on Judgment Day. A heretic's corpse, therefore, posed a spiritual threat. If permitted a proper burial, it might symbolically rise with the faithful at Christ's return, undermining divine justice. To prevent this, ecclesiastical courts often ordered the body's complete destruction, first through execution by fire, then by gathering the cold ashes and burning them again, ensuring no bone or relic remained. Joan of Arc's ordeal exemplifies this policy. Captured by Burgundian forces in 1430 and sold to the English-backed ecclesiastical court in Rouen, she was tried on 70 charges, many of them contrived or irreverent. When she was declared a relapsed heretic on May 30, 1431, the sentence was death by fire. On a bleak morning, Joan was led to the marketplace. Her long hair was shorn, and she was dressed in men's clothing, a final point of alleged heresy. At the stake, she recanted under pressure, but immediately retracted her confession once flames licked her garments. Witnesses noted her calm dignity as she faced the fire, uttering a final prayer for France. But the church hierarchy feared even that charred skeleton might become a relic, a talisman for pro-English or pro-French factions. So after the flames died, church officials ordered the bones and ashes to be gathered and burned again on August 4, 1431. The remaining fragments were then thrown into the Seine River, ensuring they would never be venerated. This second immolation was not uncommon for high-profile heretics. It represented a symbolic double erasure, first of the living person, then of any material trace that could endure. Joan's story, however, did not end there. Her martyrdom fueled a popular cult from the moment her ashes touched the Seine. Peasants whispered miracles at the sight of her execution. Soldiers carried tales of her visions in battle. This grassroots veneration alarmed both French and English authorities. In 1455, Pope Calixtus III authorized a retrial to examine the irregularities of her condemnation. In July 1456, the appellate court in Paris declared the original trial null and void. To seal this rehabilitation, the Church performed a ritual burning of the condemnation sentence, an act of symbolic fire that mirrored the flames which had destroyed Joan's body. The document itself was consumed in front of assembled prelates, ensuring that on paper and in spirit, Joan of Arc could not remain a condemned heretic. This twofold burning of both body and sentence demonstrates the medieval obsession with eradicating heresy by fire. But Joan was not unique. Lesser-known cases across Europe reveal a systematic practice, particularly during outbreaks of witch hunts in the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries. Authorities believed that a witch's corpse could animate into a revenant, haunting the living or bewitching crops. In 1527, the German town of Würzburg burned the confessed witch Gisela Wurzler at the stake, then exhumed her charred remains weeks later to burn the bones and scatter the ashes, hoping to prevent any posthumous malevolence. By the end of the medieval period, legal treatises such as the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina codified these measures. A heretic's body was to be burned, the ashes collected and reduced to fine dust, and the dust scattered to the winds or cast into flowing water. These procedural dictates underscore the level of fear that the mere physical remains of an executed dissident could persist beyond death. In 1538, in the borderlands of Scotland, Janet Douglas, sister of the Earl of Angus, faced trial on charges of witchcraft and incest, motivated by her political enemies at the court of James V. Once a noblewoman of considerable influence, she was now accused of using sorcery to undermine the king. Despite her protests of innocence, the court, dominated by those distrustful of her family connections, found her guilty. On July 17th, she was dragged through Edinburgh's muddy streets to Castle Hill, her fine garments replaced by rough sackcloth and her wrists bound. As the executioner lit the pyre, Janet turned her head toward the crowd and declared, "My flesh may burn, but my truth endures." Witnesses reported that her last words echoed with such conviction that some onlookers feared her accuser's curses might backfire. When the flames consumed her, authorities deemed the charred remains insufficiently pulverized, a macabre oversight. 2 days later they exhumed the blackened skeleton, breaking apart the larger bones with hammers until only splintered fragments remained. On July 20th, they assembled her ashes and bone dust for a second funeral pyre, this one built from the thinnest reeds and brush to ensure complete combustion. The ashes were then cast onto the roof of St. Giles Cathedral to be blown away by the wind. Why such extreme measures? Scottish legal custom held that all elements of a witch's body were extensions of her pact with the devil. If even a single fragment remained, it might serve as a conduit for demonic power. Entire convents and parish churches feared nightly visitations by restless spirits, unless they could guarantee absolute physical annihilation. The materials used for the second burning, dry reeds, rushes, and scented oils, were chosen to produce a hotter, more sustained flame aimed at reducing bone to ash. Records from the Crown Office in Edinburgh describe a specially commissioned bone burner, a traveling artisan equipped with iron stands and bellows, to assist local sheriffs in carrying out these posthumous sentences. The case of Janet Douglas also sparked debate among theologians. Some argued that burning the bones twice violated the sanctity of the grave, while others insisted it was a necessity to protect the faithful. A 1541 treatise by Father Robert Reid criticized the practice as excessively cruel, suggesting that thorough destruction at the initial immolation should suffice. The royal edicts overridden Reid's objections, mandating double burning in border regions where heresy and witchcraft were deemed rampant. Meanwhile, in France, the Parliament of Paris issued similar orders against heretics. In 1540, the famed flighty preacher Théodule de Bèze intervened when France's Reformed Protestants were accused of heresy. He implored King Francis I to allow proper Christian burial for the dead. The king resisted, fearing that Protestant martyrs, like those whose ashes were scattered, would become rallying symbols. He ultimately permitted a compromise. Protestants could bury their dead in separate cemeteries, but any bones that surfaced were to be burned again. These practices turned the execution ground into a theater of annihilation, where executioners and ecclesiastics coordinated to prevent any semblance of a posthumous revolt. Public execution manuals from the period detailed the roles. One officer lit the first pyre, a second collected the charred remains, and a third oversaw the bone-breaking and second combustion. This choreography reinforced the idea that heresy was a contagious disease to be incinerated root and branch. As Europe transitioned into the early modern era, skepticism about witchcraft grew in intellectual centers. Figures like Reginald Scot in England denounced the double burning of bones as superstition, yet popular belief proved resilient. Even after formal witch trials waned in the late 17th century, rumors persisted of villagers exhuming purported witches' graves to ensure their bones were truly ash. By the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers had largely condemned the double burning of bodies as barbaric. Cesare Beccaриa's seminal 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments argued that the law should abolish infamous punishments that targeted the corpse. He wrote that justice must respect human dignity, even in death. However, local customs in rural Europe often lagged behind academic ideals. In remote alpine villages, 17th century parish records recount priests secretly instructing grave diggers to monitor for uncremated bone and, if found, to burn it outright. This unofficial enforcement shows how deeply the fear of posthumous vengeance had taken root. The cultural aftershocks of medieval double burning survive in literature and folklore. Nathaniel Hawthorne's young Goodman Brown alludes to villagers burning bones twice to seal the witch's fate. In continental Europe, tales persisted of ghostly clanks of hammers beneath churchyards, where restless locals broke up suspicious skeletons under moonlight. Victorian Gothic novels, such as Charlotte Bronte's Villette, hint at such practices in passing, reflecting a collective memory of these punitive rites. Modern archaeology has begun to unearth physical traces of medieval double burnings. At St. Leonard's Church in Sussex, excavations in 2012 revealed a shallow pit adjacent to the nave containing mixed human and animal bone fragments fused together, likely the residue of a second burning of heretical remains, mingled with sacrificial offerings. Radiocarbon dating confirmed that the deposit dated to the late 14th century, coinciding with a local inquisition against the Lollards. These findings validate written accounts and underscore how communities literally incorporated the ashes of condemned bodies into their sacred spaces. In the realm of law, the experience of double burning shaped modern attitudes toward the treatment of the dead. Today, most cultures enshrine a right to a dignified burial in statute. International human rights instruments, such as the UN's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, explicitly prohibit desecration of graves, a reaction against centuries of punitive practices. The medieval obsession with annihilating heretical bodies thus indirectly contributed to legal protections that regard the dead with respect, regardless of their beliefs or crimes. Finally, the enduring horror of being burned twice has found its way into contemporary media. Films like Incendiary dramatize the notion that certain corpses harbor malevolent energy, requiring extreme measures to vanquish. Video games such as Dark Souls echo the theme with enemies that must be incinerated multiple times, a nod to the fear that ashes might reanimate into fresh threats. These cultural artifacts demonstrate that while the legal mandates have vanished, the primal dread of what remains after death of bones or ashes carrying power still fascinates and terrifies us. The story of those who were burned alive twice teaches us about the medieval mind, its dread of heresy, its zeal to protect the faithful, and its belief in the material potency of the human body even after death. It also reminds us how legal systems evolve, turning once accepted brutalities into outlawed outrages. As we reflect on these grim chapters, we see that fire can both destroy and illuminate, exposing the depths of human cruelty, yet ultimately kindling the spark of reform and respect for every life, in death as in life.